Welcome to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It was a scenario ripe for exploitation by a certain kind of individual. An individual that would walk away with everything, except remorse for the chaos that he caused the entire country. If there was ever a masterclass in how to pull off a good old-fashioned swindle, this was it. The Credit Mobilier of America, a fake construction company set up by Union Pacific Railroad's top brass, specifically to manage the building of the railroad. By manage, I mean funnel government money straight into their own pockets. They were billing the government about twice the actual cost of construction. And surprise, surprise, those extra millions didn't end up in new tracks or improved infrastructure. Nope, they found their way into yachts, mansions, and some nice, fat envelopes slipped to congressmen who were more than happy to turn a blind eye to their corruption. And the money-making machine got off to a roaring start. The trick was to use the construction phase to generate profit, rather than the operating phase. This allowed he and his cronies to displace his fraud and avoid responsibility for the chaos that they caused, as American as apple pie. It was a heist with VIP passes handed out to America's top politicians. We're talking members of Congress, including a future vice president, all of them cashing in on this wretched con job. For a while there, it looked like the perfect crime. Executives and their friends got richer than their wildest dreams, and the government was left holding the bill. As a crowning insult to the public trust, the schemers were never punished for their crimes. Now let's shift focus back to the folks who actually made the railroads run, the workers. They were out there sweating in the sun, freezing in the snow, risking life and limb to lay down tracks while their bosses were laughing their way to the bank. But the years following the Panic of 1873, when the economy took a nosedive thanks to the awareness of speculative greed as we previously discovered, these companies were desperate to save their precious profit margins. And how do you keep the profits rolling in when times are tough? Well, easy. You cut the wages of the worker who already can barely feed their families. Yes, in the most predictable move, the railroad companies slashed wages not once, but twice. Meanwhile, executives were still living lavishly, trying to figure out where to stash all their ill-gotten gains from the Credit Mobilier scandal. So, what happens when you test thousands of underpaid, overworked railroad workers? They don't just get angry. They stop trains, they block the tracks, and they bring the whole system to a screeching halt. 1877, in Martinsburg, West Virginia, workers decided they had finally had enough of being squeezed dry while corporate fat cats lived large. So they walked off the job, and it didn't take long for the strike to spread like wildfire across the country. Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, even as far as San Francisco, the workers rose up and demanded better conditions. With firefighters, box makers, and dock workers joining in on the strike, the railroad bosses predictably panicked. It was a powder keg, and the fuse was about to be lit. Two scabs, along with the squad of militiamen sent by the governor of West Virginia, began moving a train. As the train reached a rail switch, one of the strikers, William Vandergriff, seized the switch. John Poisel, a member of the militia company, jumped from the pilot of the engine and attempted to replace the switch. Vandergriff fired 2 shots at Poisel. Poisel returned the fire, shooting Vandergriff through the hip. When the firing was heard, a very large crowd of railroaders and citizens collected, and the situation became intense. the fuse was lit. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The city was an industrial beehive, and the workers there were just as fed up. The strike jumped the tracks and rolled right into Pittsburgh, where the railroad workers, miners, steel workers, and just about anyone who had been shafted by their bosses decided to join in. The Pennsylvania Railroad, thinking they were untouchable, sent in the militia to deal with the rabble. It was a big mistake. Thousands of angry strikers, backed by a mob of sympathetic citizens, squared off against the militia. Workers built barricades, and the militia started firing into the crowd, killing over 20 people. The city went berserk. The strikers stormed the rail yards, they lit up the freight cars, and they burned down the entire Union Depot. By the time they were done, the railroad companies were looking at a smoldering $10 million disaster. This was more than just a strike. It was a full-blown insurrection. As news of the strike spread, the strike hit Chicago, where workers didn't need much of a push to join in. Pretty soon, freight stopped moving, trains were blocked, and workers from other industries, dock workers, freight handlers, and even butchers, they decided they'd all had enough too. Then came St. Louis, where the workers decided to take things to a whole new level. They declared a general strike. Yeah, you heard that right, a general strike. We're talking about a full shutdown of the city. Railroads, factories, everything. Workers organized their own councils, and for a few chaotic days, they basically ran the city. But the fire kept spreading. Baltimore, Philadelphia, Buffalo, New York City, Cincinnati, Kansas City. It was like the strike was riding the rails themselves. Every place had its own little flavor of revolt, but the message was the same. Workers were done getting kicked around, and they were ready to fight back, even if it meant smashing a few windows or, sometimes, burning down entire rail yards. In San Francisco, Chinese workers were leading their own protest against exploitative conditions, joining the wave of discontent that spread coast to coast. The Great Railroad Strike wasn't just one city's problem anymore. It had become a national crisis. Enter President Rutherford B. Hayes. He sent in federal troops to put down the strike because apparently the one thing the government couldn't stand was the thought of train schedules getting disrupted. Forget about the fact that workers were literally starving. What mattered was getting those coal shipments moving again. God forbid the wheels of capitalism stop moving to address the conditions of its working class. No, we will continue the beatings until morale improves. So federal troops marched into cities across the country, guns at the ready, and things got ugly fast. Skirmishes broke out everywhere, from the streets of Chicago to the rail yards of Baltimore. It was like playing a game of whack-a-mole. Put down the strike in one city and it popped up in another. But eventually, the sheer force of the government started to wear down the strikers. By August 5th, 1877, the Great Railroad Strike was mostly over. Thousands of workers had been involved, dozens were dead, and the damage to the railroads was in the millions. The companies were quick to pat themselves on the back for restoring order, even though they had to call in the actual army to do it. But here's the thing. The strike didn't solve anything for the bosses. Sure, they crushed it, but the workers had gotten a taste of their own power. They saw that when they stood together, they could bring the railroads and the country to a standstill. It was the beginning of something bigger, a sign that labor wouldn't just roll over and take it anymore. Workers across the nation learned that if you push people to the breaking point, they're going to push back. And the whole capitalist machine is a lot more fragile than the fat cats would like to admit. So, who was the man? He's just another person with an unhealthy desire for more. In this case, at this specific moment in history, his name was Thomas Durant, the CEO of Union Pacific, a man who exposed a fatal flaw of the capitalist system, its government, and its politicians. A flaw that surely would be fixed soon, right?